Welcome to Rooted and Reasoned, a podcast where faith meets thoughtful inquiry. We're kicking off a brand new series today, something we think is really important, especially for you guys who are exploring what you believe.
Right.
Did Jesus exist? And for this very first deep dive into the topic, we're tackling the big one. Did Jesus really exist?
It's a question that's right at the heart of everything, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you're thinking about faith, understanding whether the central figure was a real person is a natural place to start. We're going to look at what history tells us.
Right.
From different angles.
Yeah.
Not just what's in the Bible, which is obviously key, but also what other ancient writers had to say.
Right.
Our mission today is to get a clearer picture of the historical basis for Jesus' existence using the records we have.
Exactly. Now, one of the first things people often wonder is what proof is there outside the Bible? That's a fair question. And we'll definitely get into some fascinating non-biblical historical writings.
Absolutely.
But it's also important to realize that the New Testament itself offers a ton of historical evidence.
Absolutely. When you look at the New Testament, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of mentions of Jesus Christ. Just think about that sheer number of references within those early writings.
And even if we take a more conservative view on when the Gospels were written, this is something scholars still discuss. Even those later dates still place them within roughly 200 years of the events they describe in the world of ancient documents. That's actually considered pretty reliable.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
You're right. But what's even more compelling, I think, is the strong agreement among scholars. And this includes historians who aren't Christian, about when some of Paul's letters, his epistles, which were essentially letters he wrote to early churches, were actually written, most agree they date back to the mid-1st century A.D. That's less than 40 years after Jesus' death.
Less than 40 years. That's like talking about something that happened in the 1980s today.
Right.
It's relatively recent.
Yeah.
And these weren't just quick mentions. Paul goes into detail about Jesus' life,
He does.
his death, and the belief in his resurrection. That early manuscript evidence is really significant.
It is. And to give some context, it's also vital to remember what happened in the region at that time. In 70 A.D., the Roman Empire came in and completely devastated Jerusalem. And a lot of what is now Israel. It was a really brutal invasion with widespread destruction. Whole cities were destroyed.
So many people who might have seen Jesus, so much potential evidence from that time could have been lost in that chaos.
Absolutely,
It helps us understand why we might not have countless firsthand accounts surviving today.
Got it. So, given that historical backdrop, the non-biblical accounts that did survive become even more valuable. Let's turn our attention to some of these writers, starting with the Roman historian Tacitus.
Tacitus. That's a name you hear a lot when this topic comes up. Who was he, and why should we care about what he wrote?
Well, Tacitus was a really well-known and respected historian in ancient Rome. He lived from around 55 to 120 A.D., and he's considered one of the more accurate historical writers of his time. His major work, called the Annals, documented the history of the Roman Empire.
And where does Jesus fit into his historical account?
Well, Tacitus wrote about the Great Fire of Rome around 60 A.D. Emperor Nero, looking for someone to blame for this massive disaster, pinned it on the Christians. In explaining who these Christians were, Tacitus tells us where the name came from. He mentions Christus. And he points out that this is the Latin word for Christ.
And here's where it gets really interesting. What exactly did he say about this Christus?
Tacitus states that Christus
Okay.
suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators.
Wow.
Pontius Pilate. Think about that.
Yeah.
Here you have a Roman historian writing about events within the Roman Empire, confirming not only that Christ existed, but also key details, like his execution by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Emperor Tiberius.
That's pretty significant. It's not someone who believed in Jesus writing this.
Right.
It's a Roman historian recording it as a historical fact.
Exactly. And Tacitus also notes that the name Christian originated from this Christus. This shows us how quickly this new movement Christianity grew even reaching Rome within about 30 years of Jesus' life. This raises a really important question.
Okay.
If you're wondering whether Jesus was a real person, how could such a significant movement take off and spread so rapidly, even getting the attention of the Roman emperor, if the central figure, Jesus himself, was just made up?
Yeah. It's like that thought experiment. Imagine trying to start a whole new religion in your town today about a person named Marty, who supposedly did incredible things just a few years ago and then was arrested. Everyone would know if Marty was real or not.
Exactly, yeah.
For Christianity to take root and grow so fast in first century Judea, where people would have known whether Jesus existed, seems incredibly unlikely if he never did.
That's a really clear way to put it.
Yeah.
And Tacitus wasn't the only non-Christian historian writing about Jesus around this time.
Okay.
We also have Josephus.
Right, Josephus. He was a Jewish historian?
He was. Tell us a bit about him.
Josephus lived from about 37 to 100 AD.
Okay.
He was a Jewish historian who actually wrote for the Romans.
Okay.
So he wasn't trying to promote any kind of Christian belief.
Right.
His most important work is called Antiquities of the Jews.
Yeah.
And he wrote it around 93 AD.
And he mentions Jesus in this book.
Yes, he does.
Yeah.
In one passage,
he refers to James as the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ.
Right.
This is a pretty direct and widely accepted reference to Jesus as a real person within a Jewish historical context.
Okay. And there's another, maybe more famous passage in Josephus that talks about Jesus, isn't there?
Yes, there is. It's in Book 18, Chapter 3 of Antiquities. Now, this particular passage is a bit more debated among scholars.
Right.
Because some think parts of it might have been added later by Christian writers.
Okay.
However, most historians still believe that the core of the passage reflects what Josephus originally wrote about Jesus.
Okay.
There are slightly different versions you'll find.
Okay.
One version says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats. He was the Christ. He appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him."
That version definitely sounds like it could have been written by someone who believed in Jesus.
Exactly. And that's why many suspect later editions.
Right.
But there's another way the same passage is often translated, which sounds more like what a non-believing Jewish historian might say.
Okay.
At this time, there was a wise man named Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who became his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders.
That second version seems more like a historian who's just reporting what people were saying without necessarily agreeing with it himself.
Precisely. It acknowledges Jesus as a wise and good man, mentions his followers, notes his crucifixion by Pilate, and reports the claims his followers made about his resurrection.
Right.
So, even with the questions around potential later edits, the general agreement is that Josephus, a Jewish historian, wrote about Jesus as a real figure in the first century.
So we've got a Roman historian.
We do.
And a Jewish historian.
Okay.
Both writing relatively close to the time Jesus lived. Mention him. Who else is there?
We also have Suetonius.
Okay.
Another Roman historian who was the chief secretary to Emperor Hadrian around 120 AD.
Okay.
He wrote about a man named Chrestus.
Right.
Which was a common alternative spelling of Christ living in the first century, and the trouble his followers were causing in Rome.
And that ties into the early Christian movement we've been talking about.
Exactly. Then there's Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman governor in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, in the early 2nd century, around 112 AD. He wrote letters to Emperor Trajan asking for advice on how to deal with these Christians.
What did he say about them?
Pliny described what their worship looked like. He mentioned that they would meet regularly before sunrise and sing hymns to Christ as to a god.
Right.
He also noted their commitment to living ethically and referred to practices like the love feast and Lord's Supper, which we know were early Christian traditions. This tells us that within a few decades, the belief in Jesus as divine was already well established among his followers.
So even a Roman governor trying to figure out how to handle this new religious group is documenting their central figure of worship Jesus.
Correct. We also find references to Jesus in the Babylonian Talmud.
Okay.
Now, these are Jewish writings that were compiled between 70 and 200 AD,
right,
drawing on older oral traditions.
Okay.
These writers definitely didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah.
So what do they say about him?
Well, they refer to Yeshu, which is the Hebrew form of Jesus' name.
Okay.
And they state that he was hanged on the eve of Passover.
Yeah.
A clear reference to crucifixion.
Right.
They also accuse him of practicing sorcery and leading the people of Israel astray.
It's interesting that even people who were against him acknowledged his crucifixion and the significant impact he had on people.
Yeah, it really is. We also have Julius Africanus,
okay,
who lived in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. He actually quotes an even earlier historian named Thallus,
okay,
who wrote in the mid-1st century.
Mm-hmm.
Julius Africanus mentions Thallus in connection with the darkness that reportedly happened after Christ's crucifixion.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a really early, even if it's a secondhand reference.
It is. And then there's Lucian of Samosata,
okay,
who was a Greek writer in the 2nd century,
okay,
who made fun of Christians.
Okay.
In his writings, he admits that Christians worship Jesus, followed his new teachings,
right,
and that he was crucified for them. He even mentions some of the core things Jesus taught, like the brotherhood of believers, the importance of changing your life and rejecting other gods.
Right.
He also noticed how Christians behaved, like living according to Jesus' rules, believing they would live forever, not being afraid of death, and giving up their possessions.
So even someone who was making fun of Christianity confirms that Jesus existed, some of the basic beliefs and practices about it.
Exactly. We also have Mara Parsarapian, whose writings are hard to pin down to a specific date, but could possibly be from the 1st century AD.
Right.
He confirms that Jesus was seen as a wise and virtuous man, that many believe he was the king of Israel, that he was put to death by the Jewish authorities, and yet his teachings continue to live on through his followers.
It's like a consistent echo of this person across different cultures and viewpoints from that time.
Yeah. And finally, we even have various Gnostic writings from the early centuries AD.
Okay.
These were a diverse set of beliefs, often quite different from what became mainstream Christianity.
Right.
But almost all of them still mention Jesus in some way.
So if we put all this historical evidence from outside the Bible together, what kind of overall picture do we get?
It paints a really consistent picture. These independent sources confirm that Jesus was called the Christ, that he did things that were seen as surprising feats or magic, that he taught new ideas, that he was crucified in Judea around the time of Passover under Pontius Pilate, and that his followers believed he was God and that he would come back. They worshipped him as God, and their movement grew very quickly.
It's tough to argue with that much evidence coming from people who had no reason to promote Christianity, and in some cases were actually against it.
Precisely. And I think one of the most powerful arguments, although it's not a historical text itself, is the willingness of thousands of people in the 1st century, including Jesus' closest followers, to face torture and death, rather than deny their belief in him. People will die for what they truly believe is real, but it's highly unlikely that so many would willingly give up their lives for something they know was a lie.
That's a really important point to think about.
It is.
So to bring it all together, what are the main things we can take away from our deep dive today?
The evidence is really compelling. Multiple ancient historical sources, both within the New Testament and from Roman and Jewish writers, confirm that Jesus was a real person who lived in the 1st century. Even people who weren't his followers wrote about his life, his death, and the significant impact he had on the world, leading to the rapid growth of the Christian movement.
So for you guys listening, especially if you're in your teens and trying to figure things out, knowing that the historical evidence points so strongly to Jesus's existence, what does this mean for you? What are your thoughts on who he was and why this history might matter in your own life? It's something really worth thinking about.
It definitely raises some big questions for all of us.
We hope this deep dive has been helpful as you explore these important questions. If you found this interesting, please like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive in the Did Jesus Exist series, where we'll be looking into more about his life and the claims that were made about him. Thanks for joining us on Rooted and Reasoned.